Thank you all. I think I'm going to start in with introductions, but as we get started here, please continue to add in your names and where you're calling from into the chat. Really appreciate everybody taking this time today to join us for this conversation, and look forward to having an opportunity at the end of this period to also engage with you in some questions and conversation. So just to start out with, I'm Mike Merriman Lotz. I'm the Middle East Program Director at the American Friends Service Committee. This conversation today is a conversation about annexation and the possibility of annexation of Palestinian territory by Israel, annexation and its aftermath, looking at what the possible implications of annexation are for Palestinians and Israelis. Thank you again for joining us, and again for those who weren't on, I'm Mike Merriman Lotz. I'm the Middle East Program Director at the American Friends Service Committee. I'm talking to you from my home in Philadelphia, and I'll be doing some of the introductions before turning over to my colleagues around the country and the world. As we entered into this conversation today, and as we entered into this space, I really wanted to acknowledge the moment that we are living through and that we are in right now, particularly for those who are calling in from the U.S. The great unrest and protest ongoing around the country following the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, David McAtee, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others who've lost their lives over the last weeks and months and years as a result of really systematic racism and police violence at a time when people are lifting up Black lives and saying that Black lives matter to a system that devalues those lives. It's important for us to really stand together as we push for justice and for change and for an end to systematic racism, regardless of where it is. And with all of this going on around the country, we really thought carefully about how do we enter into this conversation, and is this the time to enter into this conversation, and went back and forth on that. But I think wanted this to also recognize that the struggle for justice across the globe is one that is linked, and that we need to continue to push for justice in Palestine as we continue to push for justice and to end racism here in this country, and that we're all struggling jointly as we move forward. A little background on, and so yeah, I wanted to start there, but also transitioning to some background on AFSC. AFSC has been has had a presence in Palestine and Israel since 1948. In 1948, AFSC was asked by the United Nations to provide relief and assistance for those people displaced and impacted by the war, and set up the refugee camp system in Gaza, providing relief and assistance to those displaced into Gaza, as well as providing assistance to people displaced in what became Israel in the area of Haifa. Since that time, we've maintained a presence, and we currently have offices in Jerusalem and Gaza, and programs that work there to challenge militarization, to support Palestinians as they struggle against the fragmentation of Palestinian society, and as we work for a just peace that builds equality and works for freedom for all people in the region. This conversation on annexation is one that came about as a result of the internal conversations that we were having as staff, recognizing that it looks like we're moving into a period when the Israeli government is very likely to move to annex portions of the West Bank. And while we've existed in a reality in which there has been de facto annexation of much of the West Bank territory over the last decades, where settlement construction, the construction of the wall, the restrictions on Palestinian movement and access to territory has fragmented geographically Palestinian reality and separated people, to move from a de facto annexation to a de jure annexation, where Israel is claiming legal authority and putting those places under Israeli sovereignty and control, is a very different situation, and will have implications for people in the region and here, and also recognizing the way in which the U.S. government has been complicit in pushing forward or saying that it would recognize annexation, that those things are these are things that we need to address. And as we've talked with activists, as we've talked with our communities, as we've talked with our partners, we've recognized that there are a lot of questions that we don't necessarily all have the answers to about what this means, about how it impacts communities. But we wanted to pull together this panel of our staff to have an opportunity to talk with people about the way, from places where who will be impacted, to hear directly about what annexation may bring, in the West Bank, in Gaza, inside Israel, to activists, what the future may hold, recognizing how uncertain some of that is. And so I'm really pleased to be able to welcome all of my colleagues. It's really an amazing team, and I feel honored to be a part of this group. And so I'm going to just do brief introductions. I'll let each of the colleagues say a little bit more about themselves as they introduce themselves. But we're going to start our presentations today with Daoud Hamoudeh. Daoud is AFSC's acting country representative for Palestine and Israel, based in our Jerusalem office. Daoud is a longtime activist and organizer in Jerusalem, working with Palestinian communities and youth, pushing for change and justice in the region. Daoud will be followed by Sahar Vardi. Sahar is AFSC's Israel Program Director, also based in our Jerusalem office, and like Daoud, a longtime anti-occupation activist and anti-militarism activist, conscientious objector, and I think we'll be really thank you all both for joining us. Sahar and Daoud will be followed by Jihad Abu Sulaim, who is a part of our joint program team here in the U.S., currently based out of Boston. Jihad is originally from Gaza, moved here to the U.S. About 7 years ago, and is in the process of finishing up a PhD, as well as working full-time with us, which I'm not sure how he manages all of that together. Also a really amazing activist and incredible colleague on our Gaza work, as well as the other parts of our activism work here in the US. And then finally, we'll hear from Dalit Baum, who's the Director of Economic Activism for AFSC here in the US. Dalit is from Israel, but has been in the Bay Area for more than a decade now. One of Dalit founded the Who Profits Project at the Women's Coalition for Peace, and leads up AFSC's work on BDS and economic activism, as you can see through our Investigate website online if you'd like to learn more. Not only supporting our work on Palestine and Israel, but also divestment work that we do around the private prison industry and immigration rights and other areas. So I'm really, really excited to hear what they all have to say. Thank you all for joining us again, and I will now turn it over to Daoud. Thank you, Daoud.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for joining us here in this meeting or workshop. Well, actually, as a start, I want to present a slide online. Sure. So, in this, you could see the West Bank areas and the different proposals since 1967 until today. The white areas were always areas that been demanded by the Israelis to remain under the Israeli control. Currently, if you look at 2019, the white areas here, which is around 60% of the West Bank and the so-called C zones, is actually cutting the West Bank into small ghettos or cantons or areas isolated from each other physically. Now, this is what is happening on the ground, and this is the same offer that we are receiving since 1967 as Palestinians, annexing parts of the West Bank and isolating and cutting the West Bank into zones. Even in the most lightest plan in 1967, in Alon plan, you could see how the West Bank is already cut into two parts, north and south, and isolated from the international world, so without borders, without any access to the rest of the world. So here, what Trump is offering is, again, the same plan, exactly as in 2019, the white areas to be annexed to Israel, but making it more thinner. So instead of 60%, it will be of the West Bank to be annexed to Israel, 30% will be annexed. Most of the returned areas will be from the eastern slopes of the Jordan Valley. And again, it will remain the split or the physically cutting the West Bank into almost 22 different zones isolated from each other. The generous office of viability will be more of tunnels and checkpoints connecting between these 22 zones. Why to show this plan? To say that, again, if this is what is proposed and on the table since 1967, and this is what continuously the Palestinians refused. So 50 years of conflict did not resolve the conflict based on the Israeli vision on what should be annexed and what should not be annexed. Why Trump plan will do any different? That's first. But also, because this is the same plan since 67, and the Palestinian diplomatic activism globally had managed to create a solidarity on the Palestinian position that this could not be happening, and this is not a peace solution. So what we are seeing lately, that there is a huge opposition from two major or three major actors globally. The European Union, on one hand, the second is the UN agency, or United Nations in general, and the third is the Court of Justice. And this is why the Palestinian political elite says that, or expecting that, although from all the discussions of annexation, that it might be not happening, or postponed it, or implemented in a different way, because the states is not currently in a situation or have the intention to confront any of these three bodies. So annexing any parts of the West Bank will automatically give more power to the Palestinians to go to the International Court of Justice against Israel. And if there was a decision for the Palestinians, this means this could have implications, a lot of legal implications on Israel. The UN and the EU positions would mean a political confrontation between the states and Israel on one hand, and these bodies on the other hand. And this is not at the moment how Israel is visioning imposing this plan. Other than the public pressure in the Arab world could lead to an Arabic opposition for the implementation of the plan. So this is why, again, the Palestinians are expecting that this will not be happening soon in this, how to say it, in this way, how it is announced by Netanyahu. Rather, what we are expecting as Palestinians, that there will be more sharp or more restricted processes on ground. Not very really announced publicly, not really well known internationally, but a practice on the ground that will enforce this plan. In the last 3 months, actually, although of coronavirus and the closure of coronavirus, but we are seeing more and more settlers attacks in the West Bank, New settlements are being, or outposts are being built in the West Bank. Currently, every Bedouin community and every Headers community that will be in the expected annexed parts have a new settlement or a new settlers outpost next to it, limiting their ability to move or access to land or resources around these Bedouin communities and the others communities. Also, we are seeing more Israeli army movement in these areas and settlers attacks. The settlers attacks itself in the last 3 months had doubled in numbers. House demolition continues as is. So we are seeing almost every month around 40 to 42 house demolition and instructions demolition, like such as barracks or tents and so on, and around 11 houses on monthly basis. And this is so huge, even from in the size of what was going on before the announcing of the plan. So on the ground, Israel is implementing the plan, is forcing it. They are hoping that regardless how much time the official annexation will happen, that they will try to force the Palestinian communities that will be within the annexed part out of this area, expulsion, a soft expulsion at the moment, and in the long run there might be a more violent or more severe announced expulsions of these communities out of these areas. Thousands of our people are now expected to be expelled of their communities, again, mainly Bedouin and Headers communities, some villages in south of Hebron and east of Hebron, but the majority will be Bedouin communities. There is until now no clear numbers and statistics for this size, but we are in general talking about 60,000 people in more than 300 community all along the West Bank sea areas. That's why the Palestinian political elite is also trying to organize itself on two levels. The first one is the diplomatic level, globally and regionally, trying to raise the pressure on the Israeli government and on the state's government not to take any steps in this annexation. But again, expectations is very low on this part, that it will have an influence with neither the Israeli government or the Trump administration. The other part is on the grassroots level. There is a more organizing, a more networking is happening, I tried to create a grassroots movement within the West Bank to try to support and help these communities and their steadfastness and confront what Israel and their settlers are doing to them. I'm actually want to stop here so I can give my colleagues more time also to present their slides. Okay, so should I give it to Sahar or to Mike?
Thank you, Daoud. Really appreciate that time. And yeah, I'll just quickly turn it over to Sahar to follow up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daoud. So I'm going to try to speak a little bit more about where things stand politically in the Israeli side. And before I do that, kind of continuing from what Daoud said, is that we're in this very strange situation of objecting to something that we have no idea what it's going to look like, or it has a very large range of what it might look like. And annexation can be done very slowly and in parts, and it can be done on a very wide timetable. We're generally talking about July 1st is when this can start to be a process, but that doesn't at all mean it needs to happen then. And again, what does annexation mean? So this is kind of a very broad conversation to try to understand also what do we do in that as a movement, how do we object to that? But I think it is important to kind of say what we do know that annexation will mean legally. So while we don't know if annexation will be first just specific settlements and then other parts of Area C, or if when we talk about annexation of settlements, we're talking about the settlement itself or its municipal border, which is far broader and already includes a fair amount of Area C, so of Palestinian areas in both the West Bank and in the South Hebron Hills that have not yet really been taken over. But a few things that we do know around what does an Israeli annexation look like is the things that we can learn from East Jerusalem. And I think it is important to just, for a moment, talk about legal status that changes. And so, as an example, one of the main things that happened in East Jerusalem after it was annexed was the widening of Israeli absentee property law to include East Jerusalem, which what that means in effect is that any Palestinian who was not in East Jerusalem at the time of the annexation and had land, property, anything of the sort, lost the right to that land. And that was transferred into, the rights were transferred to the Israeli government. Now, if we look at what that will mean in the West Bank, even if there's a small annexation at the beginning of specific areas, it means that all the lands in those areas, if the people that own them, the Palestinians that own them, are not annexed as well, or not on the piece of land that is annexed, they will lose that land. So that's, for instance, one thing that we do know that will happen. And if we look at the different maps of the West Bank, when we talk about Area C, it's mostly agricultural land. As Dawood said before, it's small communities, a lot of Bedouin communities that are likely to be annexed themselves. But we do need to understand that everyone else living in cities that owns land that will be annexed will lose the right to those lands. So that's just an example of something we do know. We do know that whoever is annexed, these communities that currently live in Area C, which is somewhere between 150 and 300,000 Palestinians, we do know that they will not receive citizenship, and so they will be living like East Jerusalemites, probably in some form of residency status that can be revoked, that they can lose the right to go back to these areas. So just to kind of say what we do know about this plan that we, again, don't know a lot about. But back to the context of Israeli politics, these details are very important because there is opposition to this plan from all directions. And it's important to understand how this plan came to be. And in many ways, this was part of Netanyahu's campaign while he was running for the last election, saying that he will start this annexation. And in many ways, that was catering to the right, the parties more to the right of Netanyahu, catering to their base, to the settler movement base. And in many ways, it worked. The settler movement parties, political parties, failed in the last election. And so now Netanyahu is in a bit of a different place in which he has observed that base, and these political parties next elections are going to have to really reinvent themselves to be able to compete, which means that he's actually coming with quite a lot of power within the right to this and needs to cater much less to those needs. We do see that today within Israel, where the settler movement is really opposing this plan, and there is obviously communication and negotiation between the government and the settler movement, but we're talking about opposition from the Israeli right to this plan because it feels like, in a way, limiting what is annexed. The moment you annex something, you're not annexing something else, and this in the right is seen as very problematic, especially in the context of the wider Trump plan. But that opposition, its political space within Israel now is not what it was a year ago, because Netanyahu doesn't need that right-wing base as much as he did before right now. And so in many ways, what happened with the creation of a coalition government, of a very, very wide government, together with Kahol Lavan, blue and white, the kind of centrist, I can't even call them that, but the party that joined him, what happened with that was really solidifying Netanyahu's ability to take this plan, take the parts of it that he wants, the pace that he wants, and really it can now cater his needs and his interests and be much less pressured by other things, which is kind of a bit different. We already see him kind of slowing down this process, already conversations about the fact that July 1st is not going to happen. And it really becomes, what is Netanyahu's political interest at a given moment? And that is a big question, and that can very much vary. Now, it is important for me to say, annexation happening or not, as Daoud says, in practice, it is happening. In practice, there has been, continued to be pressure to really exclude these communities, but the legal question or that kind of what will change thing is something that right now is really going to happen according to Netanyahu's timeline, and we have much more question marks than answers on that. I will say that the place of the Zionist left also completely collapsed in the last elections. What used to be the Zionist left, the Labour Party, Meretz, and so on, hardly passing the electoral threshold. So the opposition from that side is obviously extremely weak, but maybe a little bit of optimism around that is that on the ground we are seeing a lot of opposition to this government, and it's a huge range of issues, from obviously the economic issues that come with COVID, so everything that has to do with support of people who are losing their jobs in different sectors and things like that. There's a lot of frustration coming out of that and a lot of protests around that, but also there's now a very controversial bill to extend the state of emergency that Israel is in because of COVID, and to extend the power that the government has in legislation, and there's a huge amount of protests around that. And so it is interesting to see that people are going out to the streets from this kind of centrist, left-ish perspective. I'm very careful to call it that. It's very much within the Zionist spectrum, but it is important to mention that opposition is happening. And we can be optimistic to say maybe there's a way to kind of pull that in, also to talk about annexation or other kind of extreme measures that are happening. But I also want to be realistic and say this also might have the opposite effect, take energy away from and focus away from the discussion about annexation, which is what's currently happening. There's hardly any discussion in Israel about annexation. That said, right now, as we speak, there is a large protest in Tel Aviv that is organized by all the anti-occupation organization from the more left political parties through civil society and so on. And there's thousands of people right now on the streets protesting specifically around the annexation and in the context of the anniversary of the 67 occupation. So there are voices out on the street on that. And I think that one of really the maybe trying to be a bit optimistic, one of the moments that we are right now in is how do we take all these protests that are happening, and some of them are more political than others, and connect them and make the connection between different things. Mike started by mentioning the protests happening in the US right now around racist police brutality. And it is important to say that we've had that this week as well. Last Saturday, exactly a week ago, a 32-year-old Palestinian with mental disabilities was killed by Israeli police. And that did spark protest, and it did spark hundreds of people on the streets, blocking roads, not to the extent of the US, obviously, but that is happening. And people are waking up a bit more, including to issues that have to do with racism, with police brutality, and so on. And I think it's a challenge for us now within the Israeli left to take that energy and have it mobilized to the more structural level, to issues like annexation, occupation generally. And I think that that's in many ways kind of the challenge that we are currently in. Mike, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Great. Sahar, thank you, Sahar. I really appreciate you taking this time, and that was quite insightful. Our next speaker is Jihad Abu Salim. So, thank you, Jihad.
Thank you, Mike. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is safe and healthy. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to share small PowerPoint that I made for this presentation. So I'm going to briefly talk about annexation and the place of Gaza and the Gaza Strip in this conversation. And of course, I'm giving this presentation on the assumption that annexation in the form that we are all fearing, one which will be vulgar in its scale, large in its scale, will happen, and this will include annexing large parts of the West Bank. But also I'm talking about this in light of the other scenarios that my colleagues mentioned as well. So how do we understand Gaza's place in this conversation? How do we talk about Gaza in the shadow or in light of the conversation on annexation? The first thing I want to mention here is that the Gaza Strip has been in a political limbo. In terms of the broader picture about a political solution, and in terms of providing a broader vision on how to address the current crisis within Gaza, but also how to figure out ways to achieve peace and justice while having a serious conversation about what would that look like in and around Gaza. So over the past 15 years, we have witnessed a long process of leaving Gaza out of the conversation. And I will explain how this manifests shortly. This is a map. Let's take a minute and look at this map. This is a map that I obtained from an official Israeli website. And this map basically shows Israel as one unified political entity, including both the West Bank and the Golan Heights. But as you can see here, the Gaza Strip is not portrayed to belong anywhere. It's an empty region. It's not even named on the map. And I will explain why is this happening, and part of what process this kind of process of leaving Gaza out on the map, but also politically and practically has been happening. I would like to establish 3 points that have governed the dynamic between Israel as an occupying power and the Gaza Strip over the past a few decades. The first point is that when it comes to Gaza, there isn't one elephant in the room, but there are many elephants in the room. And by that, I mean that once you start talking about Gaza, you begin to pay attention to really severe demographic, territorial, and capacity in terms of Gaza's ability to be a livable place. We all know that this year marked the year that was prophesied by the United Nations that Gaza would be unlivable. So there is a deep demographic, territorial, and capacity crisis in the Gaza Strip as a result of the blockade, but also as a result of the small territory that is Gaza. Gaza is 1% of the total area of historic Palestine. So it's a very small territory with really, really large problems that are hard to solve. The second point that governs the dynamic between Israel and Gaza is the difficulty of controlling Gaza from within. That's why in 2005, Israel unilaterally disengaged from the Gaza Strip and kept its control to one that works from without Gaza, from outside Gaza. Israel controls land, sea, and air. It controls the crossings. It bombs as it wishes inside Gaza, but it does not have a direct presence there because of how hard it is to control it from within. And this is, of course, this is a statement that can be accused of generalization. I know that, but it helps us understand the dynamic. In the West Bank, Israel wants the land without the people. Israel wants the land without giving the people citizenship. But in Gaza, Israel neither wants the land nor the people. So these are 3 important things to understand about the dynamic between Israel and the Gaza Strip. This second map I got from a website called Israel Policy Forum, which is a liberal Zionist think tank that has that follows the annexation, warns against it. And also we can see this pattern here. So it's not only reflected in the right-wing, official maps of the Israeli government, but also we can see here, even in the context of a binational state, which this liberal Zionist think tank warns against, the Gaza Strip is also excluded. So for them, the definition of a binational state is one where Israel, quote unquote, reluctantly grants West Bank Palestinians Israeli citizenship. Another aspect, another manifestation of that exclusion is a recent journal article that was published in the University of Pennsylvania Journal of International Law, where the legal scholar who wrote it, Ariel Zemach, talks about a path in international law for recognizing the right of the Palestinian population of the West Bank to Israeli citizenship. So why is Gaza being excluded from this conversation? And this exclusion, by the way, is happening despite the fact that the 1993 Oslo Accords defined the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as a single territorial unit, which must mean that if annexation happens in the West Bank, then it's both a West Bank and Gaza, and of course, a broadly Palestinian issue. And why is there a tendency to confine annexation and its aftermath to the West Bank, and how did that happen? Of course, my attempt to answer this question is going to be on a basic level. But I think this is the conversation around annexation and why certain issues are confined to certain places in Palestine and are not talked about and are not perceived as issues that concern Palestinians across geography. This is the byproduct of decades of divide and conquer policies. Unfortunately, since 2007, the Palestinian political division has been perpetuated and consolidated. This led to the deepening of fragmentation and the difficulty of achieving Palestinian unity. And here I'm talking about the diplomatic/political level of institutions such as the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Palestinian Authority. This deepening of fragmentation on an institutional level, but also on a physical level on the ground, because of the inability of different communities to visit each other, to meet each other, to work with each other, has created divergent political struggles of various Palestinian communities. And by that, I mean, the different conditions under occupation, the discrepancies in the scale and intensity and nature of oppression that different Palestinian groups are suffering from. For example, Palestinian citizens of Israel are engaged in a political/civil rights struggle. Meanwhile, Palestinians in the West Bank are focused on settlements and the appropriation of land and property. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are engaged and focused on combating and countering the impact of the blockade. Palestinians in the international diaspora are calling for the right of return. So these are all important struggles that are happening within the broader context of the Palestinian struggle, but they're happening in ways that makes these political struggles divergent. This, of course, is part of a reality where Palestinians lack a unified vision, cohesion, and coordination, and they operate in a fragmented body politic and civil society. One of the important issues here is how difficult it is to achieve Palestinian unity, even on the level of the institutions of the Palestinian Authority. Israel, in the context of the peace process, when Israel says there is no Palestinian partner who can deliver essential conditions for statehood or capable of making the historic compromise necessary for a final peace deal. But when Palestinians unify, and here I'm talking about just the basic unity arrangements that happen every once in a while between the two main parties, Hamas and Fatah, someone like Benjamin Netanyahu goes on warning the international community against recognizing a Palestinian unity government that includes multiple political parties and forces. So this is on an institutional level. On a physical level on the ground, it's been impossible for Palestinians from different parts of Palestine and from outside Palestine to be able to meet. Palestinians in Gaza cannot visit the West Bank. Palestinians in the West Bank cannot visit Gaza. So Palestinian citizens of Israel also, it's impossible for them to visit these places. So it becomes really hard to imagine or envision a cohesive, broad Palestinian vision for advocating for rights. And this leads to a reality where generally think tanks and experts and even people in the NGO world and the civil society and even people who advocate for Palestine sometimes make the honest mistake or sometimes intentionally exclude one part at the expense of another. So for example, when we think about annexation, we think about it as something that is politically and legally and morally wrong, but we don't think about it as a practical issue in the sense that Israel is actually annexing territory that Palestinians are in actual need for so that they can live and prosper and thrive. So how do we bring Gaza into the conversation, and what lessons do we learn from this exclusion of Gaza from this conversation? The first thing I think that is important for us to do as spaces that are in solidarity with the Palestinian people is to help counter Palestinian fragmentation. Palestinian fragmentation is the result of structural factors, political, legal, and economic policies, and policies can be changed. Every time Palestinians try to unite, every time Palestinians try to get together and create institutional and unity, they're faced by obstacles from the United States, from Israel, from the international community that prevent that from happening. Our role is to create better conditions that can help Palestinians overcome their fragmentation. The second thing that is important to do is to address Palestinian issues as a whole and emphasize that they are linked across geography in the Palestinian homeland and in the diaspora. Third, to highlight the repercussions of Israeli oppression as practical ones, in addition to their illegality and immorality. For example, Israel cites a practical justification for its settlement project in the West Bank, citing population growth needs. What about Palestinians in Gaza who are stuck in a small strip of land with one of the highest population densities in the world? 6,000 people live per 1 square kilometer. Even within an Oslo framework, these Palestinians must be able or have to be able to move across the geography that is recognized by the international community as one geographic unit. Fourth is to shift from a seasonal focus on Gaza or any other part of Palestine to a constant focus. Seasonal focus can be harmful and normalizes the status quo. And last is to always make sure to remember that Palestine is first and foremost as a refugee issue. And this is very evident in a place like Gaza. And that's why many avoid to talk about it, but I think it's about time to talk about this issue and highlight it. I will end here, and I will be happy to answer any questions at the end.
Great. Thank you, Jihad. And now, finally, we'll turn it over to Dalit.
Yeah, thank you very much. I see a question in the chat about maybe it's a good thing, annexation. So I want to start just by saying, obviously, what we heard from Sahar and Daoud about the implicit and explicit repercussions for people living on the ground, which means mass deportations, expropriations because of the enacting of Israeli law on whatever area is annexed. There are also implications on the political sphere. The well agreed on idea that we need to solve things by negotiation is now being denounced, and the unilateral action will make it much, much harder later to let go of these territories. But I want to add another level of repercussions, which is the repercussions to the world order. Just in a nutshell, everybody in the world should care about that, because one of the lessons from World War II was that we should make sure that people don't go to war in order to acquire a new territory. And this is a very important principle of international law. You cannot obtain territory by force. And as well as, of course, the principle of self-determination of nations. So when you have the biggest country on, the most powerful empire on earth, the US, accepting such an idea of annexation, what it means is that we are coming into a new era of world wars. Unfortunately, that's what it could mean. And it really doesn't matter what is the extent of the annexation. This is a principled thing. So what we need is a wave of resistance. What we need is trade sanctions on Israel from all of its trade partners. What we need is denunciations from all over the world. What we need is from the movement, from grassroots movement, at least the response that was after the flotilla or cast lead. You know, people went out to the streets and we had campaigns going, and suddenly the campaigns flared up and succeeded because everybody wanted to do something on these issues. We need something like that, and we don't see it. And so I'm going to talk about their response or possible responses in the US, because this has not happened yet. And as Sahar said, we don't really know what is going to happen. In fact, it is being negotiated right now. So the extent of the annexation, or whether or not there is going to be annexation, is something that can still be influenced by whatever happens in the world. And there is a very short window of opportunity for annexation. If you read the Israeli political press analysis, it's all about between July and the elections in the US in November. So this is the window of opportunity. This is also a window of opportunity to block it. On the other hand, what we know is happening in the US, we have COVID-19, and we haven't flattened the curve yet. And there is also an intifada. People are finally going out and resisting the growing rise of authoritarianism and fascism in this country. There is a lot more visible state violence that we're aware of, starting with the border and the outrageous attacks on civilians on the border, but also mass surveillance and now public lynchings that we see again and again. So there's a lot of drama, and a lot of very important drama and very, very relevant drama. But it also can create the appearance that maybe people over here in the US might not have the bandwidth to deal with what's happening in Palestine. And we'll think of it as something that is very remote and not related to them. So I want to suggest three actions, specific actions. One is really about realizing that this is not happening in Palestine. And this is not really Israeli politics. This is US politics. This is domestic US politics. As Sahar explained, it is no longer Netanyahu's driving interest to go towards annexation at all costs. He doesn't need that crazy right-wing base. He probably needs to appease them somehow, so they're looking for some kind of compromise. But what is important right now is Trump's political position before the elections. Does Trump need to appease his evangelical Christian base or not in order to do that? Maybe annexation. Maybe this is not a good time for him. This is his, not his, but his administration's considerations. So this is about domestic US politics. None of it is going to happen without Trump's, the administration's approval, but not only that, without the administration pushing for it. And that means also that Democrats have a lot of power. I read a lot of polls about what's happening with the elections, and I read them on the Israeli press. So the idea that maybe Trump is not going to be reelected is very important for these considerations. So we need to approach candidates on all levels and Congress people on all levels and ask them to take a public stance, and also maybe threaten with sanctions against annexation. In fact, the FEC has a petition up. Maybe I will share my screen as well. I hope it works. Let's see. So we have this petition up that people are invited to sign on. But this is just one action, so we can do a lot more in reaching out to politicians and having that kind of a public stance right now. And maybe we can share that link on the chat. Another kind of action is something that we've been working on for a while now, which is to join the Platform for Black Lives that has a divest, invest strategy, which says public funding should not go into policing, and it should not go into military, and it should not go into mass surveillance or detentions. It should go into our general good. It should go into our communities' education. It should go into healthcare. It should go into supporting people's lives and not destroying them. It sounds very basic, but this is a basic platform for the movement that we are all part of right now in the US. And it includes in it also divestment from the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the military aid to Israel, all these companies, which are many times the same companies that support these repressive regimes and repressive technologies and so on. So we're all part of the same movement. And this movement is the BDS movement, of course, just putting it out there. But this movement is a movement that actually traditionally looks at multinational forces. All of these large technology providers, all of these large think tanks that promote these ideologies, they try them out in different parts of the world and then they implement them in other parts of the world. This is really not just domestic. And anyone who works on these issues sees the similarities between how it is being used in different parts of the world. So this is the right way and the right place for us to create a whole new vision that includes both the domestic and the international. One way to do that, of course, I want to introduce for those of you who haven't seen it, our website, Investigate. We'll put the link in the chat as well. This is a tool that you can use to scan your own investments if you have any kind of a pension fund or anything like that, or the investments that are of any institution you're associated with. Is it your church, or is it your university, or is it your union, or any organization you're associated with, and make sure that you're not invested in any of these companies. What you don't see here is how you can reinvest in things that promote life. And there are many, many resources for that. You can contact us also for help about that. One of the main oppositions to this new vision, to this new idea of divest invest, is the movement against BDS or the anti-BDS legislation, which is in its basic level an annexation movement. And let me just say a word about that. There was a wave of legislation across the US on the national as well as state levels against BDS. And also a propaganda campaign, not just legislation campaign. And all of it in the last few years, in the last 4 or 5 years, was actually fueled by the settler movement. It was all about the fact that if you treat settlements differently than you would treat Israel, if you differentiate settlements, as was the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2334 about differentiating settlements, then in a way you are boycotting a part of Israel, quote unquote, and therefore you are participating in BDS, and therefore you are anti-Semitic, hateful, and that should be unlawful. So it was a settler movement that was trying to promote annexation, that was moving all these legislation ideas forward in different parts of the world, and many of them in the US. So this is just a slide to remind me to tell you about these initiatives we have across the country of cities that try to push for intersectional divestment, making sure that cities are not invested in human rights violators anywhere around the world. And in 2 places in New Orleans and in Portland, Oregon, these were blocked, these legislations, because of the fear that this might be seen as BDS, because human rights also include Palestinian rights. So the two are very intricately connected. The idea that we do not want to be invested in harm and in repression and in human rights violations anywhere around the world. And the idea that that means also divesting from the Israeli oppression of Palestinians, and therefore it is BDS. It is BDS. And finally, I want to propose a third strategy, which is a kind of a type of one category of the second strategy, which is to refocus our efforts on settlement activities. I know that many among our movement are kind of sick and tired of that and say, oh, this is a two-state format and it's obsolete, but it is not. In fact, with the ideas of annexation, companies that are part of the settlement industry are actually facing increased risks because now they are also complicit in another level of illegality, not just the illegality of the settlements themselves, but the illegality of annexation. Another risk stems from the difficulties that they might face in leaving their businesses in the settlements. Because if before it was hard, and it was hard to explain in the Israeli right-wing public opinion setting, now if these areas are considered part of Israel, then it will be hard for them to stay and operate in Israel as a whole. Just looking at the situation inside Israel, it will be harder for them to leave just the settlements. So we think that it's a really opportune time to look again at the list published by the UN just recently, a couple of months ago, of businesses in settlements. It's not a complete list. If you want a complete list, go to our website, investigate, but it is still a list published by the UN. And one of the companies highlighted there is General Mills. What you see on the left is a picture that maybe Sahar had something to do with, of their factory in Atarot industrial zone, which is in an occupied settlement, occupied territory in a settlement near Jerusalem. And this is where they make frozen baked goods for the Pillsbury brand. And I think this is a really great time to make some fuss about that and to ask General Mills to step away from this complicity and close that factory. Thank you. I will stop here and actually move this to you all. We invite you all to ask any of your questions or comments in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalit. And if we can invite maybe all of the speakers to come back onto the camera, or turn your cameras back on. Thank you. And as Dalit said, if you have questions, start to put them into the chat. I've been taking a couple as we've gone along, trying to track what's been in the chat. And so maybe just to start, there were a couple of kind of basic questions. I'm going to combine a couple together, and if you guys could maybe see about answering them. There was a question, a couple on Dawood's presentation about, and I think they linked to others. It was touched on somewhat, but there was a question on whether or not there's thoughts on if Palestinians will be expelled from areas where that will be annexed, as well as a question about the maps that you showed, Dawood, about what that the current map is much more fragmented than the 1970s map, and what was it that led to that much more fragmented reality in the current present situation. And then, sorry, just to add on to these on some basic ones, if somebody knows about how many Palestinians have been ethnically cleansed from Area C already, and I'll start to gather some others if we start with those.
Okay, but I also want to say something quick about the last question about a two-state solution and if it's better or not. Well, it will have a human cost, and this is what we are refusing. Whether it will be implemented or not implemented, better or not better, there is a human cost that we are refusing to be paid on both sides. So we are not saying, yeah, maybe it's better for the Palestinian movement, but again, let's keep on mind the human cost and what could be lesser human cost for all of us. On ethnic cleansing, like no state since 60s or 70s had announced any plans to do an ethnic cleansing, although that was happening and still going on in different areas. And here in Syria and even in Iraq, in Africa and in other places. But even the most underdeveloped countries in Africa never said that they will do an ethnic cleansing campaign against someone. So it always will have different names. In Hebron, in south of Hebron, for example, they say these are illegal built-up villages, so they are willing to demolish all these villages and ask the people to move out of these areas. In other areas, in the Bedouin communities, these are military zones, so Bedouins are asked to leave these areas, and so on. So there are different titles. Israel is not a dumb country. It's a clever country, and there is always names. Even in science, you have names that are more beautiful than expulsion or ethnic cleansing, such as in city planning, they have something called aggressive urbanization. How to decrease the population of an area in a favor of another area. So there are different terms that is used. There are different approaches that has been used. Since 67 until today, there were hundreds of cases and decrease of population that was recorded on different within different Palestinian organizations. There are now ghost cities. If you go to the Jordan Valley, you can see, because in 67 people were expelled out of these areas. Of course, it wasn't directly in the war. This has all happened after the war. Expelled to Jordan and in other areas. When you go to any Bedouin community and read the history of that community, you could see how populations dropped continuously since 67 until today, and number of families are reducing instead of raising, and more people are moving from these areas to city centers or other areas. So yeah, there is different studies, different statistics. Some of them are focusing after Oslo Agreement. Others are looking at the historical degrowthing that was happening in these areas. And finally, there was a question about, sorry, just let me see the comment. I missed one question, right? Where did I put the question? The maps, why it looked more. Actually, because the settlers movement or the colonial movement, historically, Israeli or non-Israeli, is a very greedy movement. This is not about Israel, this is about the whole settlements, settlers, colonial mentality that comes along with the settlements movement. So, of course, in more than 50 years, the settlers movements inside the West Bank became more and more greedy. The needs of Israel had changed. So, for example, this maps allows Israel to annex most of the water resources in the West Bank, which Israel suffers from shortage in water, annexes most of natural resources such as stones, some minerals to inside Israel, annexes some environmental areas. Jordan Valley is good for producing a specific kind of dates, majul dates, and Israel controls 70% of the global market of this product, and this is in the Jordan Valley and other areas. So the needs of Israel had changed in 50 years since the first map until today. The greediness of the settlers movement had growth more and more. In 20 years since Oslo until now, the number of settlers in the West Bank jumped from 250,000 almost to around 600,000 settlers. This is higher, a growth that is higher than any place, more than any other area in the world. So, and this means, implies that they need more spaces, of course, and more areas and more land for their economical growth and need and so on. Also, settlers movement tends to be a luxury movement because you need to persuade people to move from their comfort zones, peaceful areas, to a war zones to settle in. So, for example, you could notice that the settler in the West Bank spends or consumes 7 times, 7 times as Palestinians of water, and the double of the same Israeli who's living in Tel Aviv, because he needs more virtual baths, parks, green areas, spaces around him that could give him a luxury life to keep him in this settlement. And this requires annexing and confiscating more and more lands. Thanks.
Thank you, Dawood. There's a question, and maybe Jihad and Sahar, if you can take an answer on this, our first chance. There was a question about, do you think that the hyper-focus on July 1st could actually harm anti-annexation advocacy, and especially if Israel moves slowly in all of this?
Well, I'll start, and Jihad, if you want to add something later. I think, and I mean, Dalit said that there's in many ways this window of opportunity, right, between July and the U.S. elections. I do think it's important to say, obviously, this is only assuming Trump loses the U.S. election. If he does not, then that's a whole other question, and that window becomes no longer a window. But there's a risk there for the Israeli government if they do want to move this forward, and so we do have a window. And in that sense, focusing the advocacy on that is important. It's also all we have right now, that date. But I think it is important when we do that advocacy to also think in terms of what happens if it's not the political interest and there isn't annexation in October or November or leading back from that. And that's important to kind of make sure that our advocacy around that is in the context of occupation generally. It's not just about annexation, it's kind of wider around all the things that we've been always saying, and how do those translate into including the kind of concrete asks specifically around annexation. And I think I just want to connect that a bit to one of the questions that was here later on around kind of the increase in allies on the ground, obviously from J Street, but also kind of more Israeli organizations like the Commanders for Israeli Security and all these kind of very classic, very hardcore Zionist, theoretically left groups here that are speaking out against annexation. And there is kind of that wave of NGOs and statements and things of the sort. But I think that one of the things, again, that our job in that is to continue to remind us that it's not just about annexation, that it's a much wider issue than that. Annexation, I mean, even if the annexation does not happen, we continue obviously to resist the occupation, and that needs to be said. I think the other thing that's important to say around this kind of really wave of people objecting this is that it is very much on a statement level. And I think that our job as a movement is really understanding how we move that from a statement level. And it's great that there's so many organizations putting out statements, and all the NGOs and INGOs, and they are coordinating between themselves and until they find the right language to put a statement out. And we see that here locally, we see that with international organizations and stuff like that. We see that in the EU, right? All the foreign ministers of all EU countries met only to talk about this in the middle of COVID. Like, that is a significant thing, but all we're seeing coming out is statements. And if those statements don't include sanctions with them, if they don't include what are steps that are happening, then that is probably not going to be enough to prevent this. I will just say one more thing about US politics in this context. When Biden spoke against this, it was interesting to see the reaction within Israeli media and politics, which was a conversation saying, well, maybe we don't actually have that window, because if Biden wins and we've already annexed, and it turns out that he actually does mean some form of criticism that he'll translate into actions, then that's too late. like we will be suffering from those actions anyway. So that's another kind of interesting discourse to think, but it really is only relevant if we're moving from statements into what are the sanctions that come with them.
I mean, I second what Sahar has said, and I think it's important to avoid the seasonality in our work. There are moments when momentum can be garnered around a specific event, but whether that event happens in the way we expect it to happen, in the scale that we expect it to happen, whether it will be history changing and it will be large and unprecedented or not, that doesn't matter. What matters is that we, in our work, in our planning, in our thinking, we do not let the occupation decides the agenda and marks days on the calendar, because even when the occupation does not commit its crimes or violations according to a specific date, it's a process that is happening on a daily basis, and it is experienced every day by people whose lives are impacted negatively. For example, when a lot of momentum happens around military operations against Gaza, when they happen like in 2014 or 2012 or 2009, 2008. But when these operations end, the blockade continues. If annexation as a formal step happens in a large scale, or if it happens gradually, there will still be land confiscation. There will still be all sorts of human rights violations happening and affecting people's lives. So it's important to pay attention to dates, in the sense that they can be an opportunity for us to mobilize and build our work, but also it's important to have an attitude that works in between these moments and makes sure to continue our momentum and to continue our mobilization in ways that are not seasonal, but rather part of a larger and broader continuous vision that builds on previous work, present work, and plans for the future.
Thank you, Jihad and Sahar. Dalit, there are a couple of questions that you've responded a little bit in the chat to, but it would be good maybe to say something about. There's a question about the Pillsbury campaign. People hadn't heard about it and where that stands, and then a question about the Black Lives Matter platform as a platform for intersectional activism, and if that's a direction that the BDS movement might move, and if you could maybe say a word about those things.
Yeah, so these are two different directions. First of all, with companies doing business in settlements, even if the area where they do business, which is usually an industrial zone as part of a settlement, is annexed into Israel, and we expect these to be part of the first wave of annexation, because that's the main settlement blocks, the Ariel settlement areas and so on. Even if they are annexed into Israel, they are still illegal by international law, because the annexation is illegal. And so in the past, we had BDS campaigns against companies doing business in the Golan Heights and in East Jerusalem, which were also areas annexed unilaterally into Israel. And the fact that the US would recognize this annexation, unfortunately, just means that they will not be seen as doing illegal activities by US law, but that still doesn't change international law. So they can still be BDS targets, and they should be BDS targets. And I think, as I explained before, the expectations of companies doing business in a conflict zone is actually to follow international law, not domestic law. And that is the very mainstream basic expectation. It's not, I work with socially responsible investors. All the language around human rights makes that very, very clear. So this is about targeting. As for specifically General Mills, this is a new budding campaign. We hope it will become a national campaign. We think it can be a really fun campaign because of the Pillsbury Doughboy. That is this cheerful image that I didn't know anything about, but now I'm learning more about, and so cheerful. It's so crazy cheerful that it's fun to make fun of it a little bit. It's hard to launch a new national campaign at this moment in the US, as you can imagine. But that means that we really want to encourage everybody to think of actions they can take locally. Many of these campaigns, they just start locally. So if they have a factory or an office near you, if they are sold in a big grocery store that you can talk to the shop owners and ask them to drop these products, we can help you with education materials and brochures, and we will also work on a website. And I think other organizations will take it on as well, and that will be very, very helpful. What else was there? There was one other question. The platform for Black Lives. This is bigger. I do believe that the only hope for us in the US and in Palestine is to create a strong push, a strong alternative to the powers of authoritarianism and fascism that we are fighting against all around the world, and wherever we can. And the US is a very important location for that. And we see this movement growing now in the streets, and this is our movement. We need to be part of this intersectional movement that creates a new vision. A new vision across the board. These are no separate issues. So dropping the idea that we need to reach out to other struggles and work on their issues so they will care about other issues. These are the same issues. This is the same vision. And Invest Divest is one platform, and it includes in it BDS, but it includes so much more. And it includes also caring for our own communities here in the US and caring for all sorts of issues that were traditionally seen as separate, like immigrant rights or racial justice. They are not separate. I know it's easier said than done, I know, but as a vision, I think it's a very exciting one, and it's one that is inevitable, and this is where we are in this moment in time. So reinvigorating BDS campaigns. This was the question. This is exactly the way forward.
Thank you. And I'll leave this open to anybody to take, but there's a question about legal strategies and whether or not there might be legal strategies that complement grassroots struggle as a way of catalyzing movement forward and change. And that's kind of coming from the history of the International Court of Justice ruling that the building of the wall and the route of the wall through the West Bank was illegal. And yet the lack of action towards that to hold Israel accountable for that illegal action. And that lack of movement was really a catalyst for the BDS movement and for that call in Palestine and the push, and whether or not there might be other legal strategies that either are already moving forward or that could be pushed forward that would complement what's happening on the ground.
I can just say real quickly that the International Criminal Court negotiations now are a huge issue. They are weighing on all of these decisions, and to see what is going to happen with that will influence all the Israeli decisions in the matter. I think that the idea that David wrote in the chat of running legal campaigns against companies in the US, we have looked into such ideas in the past. It wasn't seen like a friendly arena, the US legal system. And we see how the opposition is using that legal arena against companies, like how Airbnb was sued after it adopted a reasonable policy about not doing business in settlements. They were actually sued in the US, and that caused them to backtrack. So such legal cases have a better chance in other parts of the world, mainly Western Europe. And even there, anti-BDS legislation made it harder in some places. And also, I think they take a lot of time to fruition. So if our window of opportunity is indeed until November, or as somebody wrote in the chat, until January, I do believe in grassroots activism. We should just do what we can. But yeah, let's hope some legal scholars are thinking of ideas of how to sue them.
Other thoughts?
Our history and experience, nothing works without grassroots pressure on these institutions. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah. No, that's great. Maybe we're coming up towards the end of the time. Are there maybe just final comments from the panelists? Anything that you'd like to say as we move out?
I think I just want us to, like, I know we've discussed a lot of question marks. We've discussed a lot of reasons why that, and I think all of us, I mean, especially people in the US, but all of us are kind of, our brains in many places are somewhere else. A lot of this conversation feels a little bit theoretical sometimes. And I just want to kind of bring it back and say that on the ground, including in protests happening now against police brutality, both here, there, and things of the sort, like these connections are being made, and I do feel like that there is energy that if we kind of bring it in, it is there. And I just want to kind of, I don't know if to finish on a kind of more energizing note, but I think that there is a lot of energy around this. People are interested, and it is an opportunity for us to kind of take that, whether the July 1st date is relevant or not, or November, or any of that is actually relevant. The energy around it is something that's relevant for us, and we really should be mobilizing and using.
Any other final comments? If not, I really want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate this. Thank you to Dalit, Sahar, Daoud, and Jihad for spending this time and the information that you've all provided. It's been really helpful. I do want to just encourage people to take action. As was said, we have an action alert on our website. Dalit pointed to the Investigate site. And keep an eye on ways that you can take action. I know that there are organizations already talking about legislation here in the U.S. to condition or end U.S. aid if annexation moves forward, that there will be various ways that you can engage moving forward. As I think was said a couple of times, this is a political moment when, despite all of the challenges that we face, both from very right-wing governments here in the U.S. and in Israel, there's also an opportunity in that we've seen movement at the political level that's here in the U.S. on House Resolution 2407 through our No Way to Treat a Child campaign, representatives calling for an end to the blockade in the last few months, and openness to this. And I think that the initial conversations that people have been having at the Hill level shows a lot of concern about the move towards annexation. Obviously, the harm that's going to come if that happens to people on the ground is something that needs to be our primary concern, and how do we impact that? But there are opportunities to engage, and to say that as a way of saying don't lose hope that we are in a moment of transformation, and despite all of the challenges that face us and some of the difficulties that can feel overwhelming, we're also seeing moments of transformation. So I think if we can all continue to push together, whether that's against annexation or for the movement for Black Lives, it's important that we do join together in activism. And so thank you all for taking this time with us. Thank you again to the panelists, and that's it for today, but we'll have a recording, and if you'd like to share it, we'll try and get that out to everybody in the not too distant future. Thank you.